Okay, now I am pleased to transition to the part of our session about our latest book in the series that Ryan mentioned. Research on integrating language and content in diverse contexts. It's the 9th volume in our series. The series editors, as Ryan I think mentioned, are Kathy Bailey and Ryan Damrow. And this particular volume was edited by MaryAnn Christison, who's here, Jody Crandall, and myself. The series features doctoral dissertation grantees and other experts in the field. And this particular volume includes a foreword by Professor Chris Davison of the University of New South Wales, and then is accompanied by chapters by an international group of scholars. Another thing I will mention, again, I'm not sure if Ryan did, Ryan has a few copies of several books in the series if you'd like to come up at the end and look at the table of contents or check them out. So they're also completely available, the table of contents online. This book has 13 chapters organized by educational level, primary, secondary, and post-secondary. And the focus is on approaches to integrating language and content in various national contexts and at different educational levels where English is being learned as an additional language. The contributions report on empirical research. As you noted, many of them come from doctoral dissertation grantees who are reporting on the research from their dissertation. Dealing with models, in this case, like content-based instruction, content and language integrated learning or CLIL, English medium instruction, and other variations on this theme. Our presentation includes a number of the authors from the volume and is going to be organized. We're going to hear from the first 3 presenters, and then we'll have time for discussion. And then we'll hear from the final 2 presenters, and then have time, we hope, at the end for more discussion of those 2 and possibly all of the chapters being reported on. Okay, I'd like to begin with our first speaker. Beth Clark-Gareca, who will be talking about her chapter, The Bottom Group, How Teacher Expectations, Tracking, and Standards Contribute to EL Underrepresentation in STEM. Please welcome Beth.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
It's nice to be with you this morning and to have an opportunity to collaborate with all of you in the name of TIRF. So this study was part of the curriculum on dissertation, and I was a DDG recipient quite a while ago, and TIRF made a really big difference in my finishing of my doctoral program. So I just wanted to start with that thanks. So what do we know? Just some information about STEM materials, the focus of this study. So we know that STEM instruction at the elementary level is really important, that we need to identify mathematically minded children and move them into the mathematical arena relatively early, because math tends to be such a key discipline, and so we need for them to get in that linear role pretty early. We know that early access to math leads to math study in high school, and then further on it moves to STEM pursuits, which is something that we're pretty committed to here in the United States. In science programs, so moving from math to science, programs like coding and robotics, these are being started, these clubs are starting earlier and earlier, because we're trying to meet a scientific demand that's new here in the United States. But what do we know about STEM? Well, historically STEM capital has been the property or been owned by white men, and that's pretty well documented. And so these agencies here in the United States are trying to counter some of these things, including the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. who examined STEM pathways and tried to figure out ways to support and guide students from minoritized backgrounds, including, and also the National Academy of Science, National Academy of Engineering, and Institutes of Medicine have highlighted concerns related to the low numbers of non-white scientists and engineers in STEM. And so what's interesting, you know, my dissertation study focused around 4th grade, primarily Latino students, around their taking assessments in math and science. And so it occurred to me that often Latinos in science may start as English learners. And so how does that happen? How can they pursue an ELL curriculum and also reach levels of math and science that will set them up well for careers in STEM? So the questions that guided this particular part of the study were: what beliefs do teachers in elementary grades draw on when teaching and assessing and placing English learners? And then maybe more specifically for this presentation, what explicit and implicit school and institutional structures are in place that may have an impact on that. So my participants, this study was done in 2 school districts in 7 schools with 10 4th grade classrooms, 10 4th grade teachers. I also did interviews with 50 4th graders, but that part is not included in this part of the study. The teachers that I included, 6 of them were exclusively math teachers, 3 of them were exclusively science teachers, and then 1 was, you know, in 4th grade, sometimes you teach all of the classes. So there was 1 teacher who was both a math and science teacher. And here are their names in their classrooms, just giving you a little bit of information about that. You can see in that second to last column, it refers to the rank of the class. So the classes were ordered in terms of, you know, how many math classes were there, how many science classes were there, et cetera. And so these particular classes, like Mr. Baker's class, there were 4 math classes. This was considered the bottom class. And that's where 11 of the 23 students, that's where 11 of the English learners resided. And that ranking was determined by students' reading scores from the prior year. So in 3rd grade, they took the Pennsylvania state tests, and they didn't score high, you know, whatever they scored, they were determined where they would fall into math by those reading scores. Okay, so you can see a problem already, right? So methods and analysis, you know, I did 3 observations in each classroom, and I did teacher interviews revolving around their assessment practices and how did they make instructional choices for English learners in their classroom, and then I transcribed the interviews and coded them, etc. Okay, so let's look into some of the findings which are interesting. So teacher beliefs about academic content. When these teachers were working in these classrooms that were heavily ELL represented, 5 of them said that they just took, the math teachers, they just took the word problems out because they were too demanding for the English learners, so they thought, well, you know, we'll just give them other kinds of math problems. 7 focal teachers mentioned that science was really difficult because of the complexity of language. I mean, we know this to be true, and so the teachers made adjustments based on that. But like Mrs. Pally said, they're not words that they use every day. See, like condensation, you know, that's not a word that's normally used. Evaporation, it's a little difficult. So if Mr. Rockney thought that science was all words and they couldn't work in the English language yet. There were tensions around textbook use. So we know that in math and science, often there are big textbooks. Well, now we're moving more digitally, right? But there are often textbooks that are used as the basis for those curricula. And 6 of the focal teachers didn't think that the content textbooks were well suited for instruction or assessment for English learners. So Mr. Roswell said, it involves a lot of reading. And I don't think there's any lesson in the book that doesn't involve reading. So it makes it difficult. And probably most interesting is that 3 teachers didn't allow our participants to take the books home because of concerns that the books wouldn't come back. Okay, well, anybody who's ever taught elementary school knows that this happens. You know, you send books home and you don't see them again. But these practices, the teachers told me, were differentiated, that the higher tracks of math did take the books home, but the lower tracks of math didn't. So, very problematic. In terms of standardized testing, this is kind of what I spoke to before, that their PSA scores, that's the standardized test in Pennsylvania, were used to track them. And so their tracking decisions were made. And you can see that these were, of the classrooms that I studied, these were where the majority of English learners resided. And the overall belief was that these placements were in the students' best interest, right? So the English learners were clustered, and then they were clustered for logistical ease so that they could, a lot of these things are very institutionally, they make a lot of sense. You cluster them together so that you can pull them out and give them the minutes that they need, that they are entitled to, and it's easier on the scheduling. But that was arranged around ESL or reading support. And some of these sections were called the EL section for math and science, right? That's the EL section. And so they were in these lower sections. And assessment took place differently in those lower sections than they did in the upper sections. So if we're thinking about access to STEM, what kinds of systems are we setting up, thinking about these fourth graders moving forward and becoming scientists in their future? So what I did find out was that some teachers really had an eye to this, and they said, I know that there are a couple of these kids that are doing really well. We can move them up. So even though it was difficult, two math teachers who were particularly inspiring said, I'm going to move them up. I don't think they belong in the bottom group. Mr. Baker said, for example, I'd like to move Gonzalo out of this low section, but they, meaning the administration, might say to me, well, we can't because of his reading. Because at this grade level, anyway, it's much more reading driven as far as the grouping. And then continuing, when I asked, are there any English learners in the highest section in your school? And he said, not to my knowledge, but it's not like it's an excluded thing. It's not like we say else can't be. It's based on reading. So that's just really, if you try to unpack that a little bit, it's a pretty contrary thing to say about how math is based on reading, and so students have to stay in this bottom math group. So implications for future research. In this study, and reanalyzing this data, L access to STEM was really being impeded in systematic ways, structurally, not even in the teacher's control necessarily, but these were just policies that were enacted. There was this trouble with what I'm calling benevolent dependence or loving low expectations. We don't want to make the English learners uncomfortable. We want them to be safe and happy, and so we'll keep them in a place where things are easy. And I don't blame teachers for that. These teachers really loved their students, but they were not challenging them rigorously enough for them to be able to take their rightful place in science going forward. An implication for this is I think steps need to be taken to audit EL STEM pathways in schools, to make sure that there are systematic places where stock is taken at different points of the proficiency cycle, where we look at, is this child showing a gift for math or for science, and can we make steps to make sure that they are granted access? I just wanted to say thank you, and I have this, the research was generously funded by a doctoral dissertation grant from TIRF. Again, this is from my dissertation, and I remember when I got that award, I was asked to always thank TIRF on behalf, and I continue to thank TIRF. Thank you.
Thank you for doing that. Good job, Beth.
Okay, our next presentation is on a chapter by Donna Krulatz and MaryAnn Christison on working toward a multilingual paradigm and content-based English language teaching, implications for teacher education, and Anna will offer the presentation.
Thank you, Donna. It's so nice to be here this morning. Thank you all for attending. So our chapter is more conceptual than empirical. I will be talking about a multilingual model for education in content-based contexts. So first, I just wanted to take a brief look at this current situation we're in. Multilingual kind of happening all around the world. Okay, I'm not very good with these devices. I'll lean forward. So we see this multilingual turn, this recognition of rich linguistic and cultural resources that students bring with them to the classroom all around the world. The idea is to start moving away from the monolingual paradigm and this recognition of a native speaker as the ultimate norm and the goal towards which multilingual students should be progressing, but rather acknowledging that multilingual individuals are different than monolinguals. They have rich resources on which they can draw in the classroom and outside of the classroom as well. And so in teacher education, it's important to prepare teachers for this new reality and recognize that teachers need not only expertise in grade level content, but they also need language awareness and metalinguistic knowledge. They need to be able to draw on these rich resources that students bring with them. They need to support students' multilingual identities as a part of the learning process, and adopt and enact ideologies that actually view multilingualism as a positive resource rather than an obstacle. And so to help teachers enact the multilingual term, we wanted to propose what we call multilingual approach to diversity in education, MADE for short. And it's an instructional framework and a set of principles that are grounded in current research in language acquisition, in multilingualism, in language education, and content integration. And it's a model that promotes practices that actually acknowledge the richness of the resources and the value of multilingualism. So in the brief presentation today, I'll go through the model quickly and then talk briefly also about some areas where it can be applied. So the tool consists of 7 specific indicators, and each indicator has features. I'm not going to go through these here, not through the features, but I'll present the indicators more broadly, and then I'd like to refer you to the chapter if you would like to learn more details about it. So the 7 indicators are classrooms and schools with multilingual developing and using teaching materials, interaction and grouping configurations, language and culture aptitude, metacognition and metalinguistic awareness, multiliteracy, and teacher and learner language use. And so I'll go through these 7 and provide support from research for why we wanted to include that. So the first indicator, classrooms and schools as multilingual spaces, it considers the importance of classroom spaces and a part of culturally and linguistically sensitive teaching. And it stresses the importance of making students' linguistic and cultural resources visible through, practices such as displays, but also practices such as translanguaging and talking about the resources that students have, raising awareness of the importance and value of these resources. So some examples to make students' languages visible is to display their work on classroom walls, is to create specially designated areas in the classroom such as multilingual corners, and again, practices such as translanguaging as a part of the learning process. The second indicator, developing and using teaching materials, stresses the importance of selecting materials that promote the use of various languages, that activate students' linguistic repertoires and do not just focus on the language of schooling or the majority language, but rather draw on these different resources. So it's practices such as asking students, well, how do you say it in your language, or providing bilingual dictionaries and access to various bilingual or multilingual tools. And it's important that teaching materials should support the development of skills in all different languages and not just in the majority language. So it's supporting these home languages or students' own languages in addition to helping them develop, for instance, proficiency in English. The next indicator, interaction and grouping configurations, stresses the importance of frequent opportunities for interaction among students and not just teacher-fronted instruction, and also for selecting groups in a way that is culturally and linguistically sensitive, but at the same time supports both content and language objectives. So it's making teachers sensitive to, well, how do I integrate what I know about my students into how I'm going to group them for a specific task or for a specific lesson? and varying these configurations based on different needs. So not always putting students who speak the same language together, but also not always mixing them up. So for some activities, it may actually be more appropriate that they support each other in a shared home language, whereas for other activities, it may be more appropriate to put them in mixed groups. So that's what this indicator addresses. Language and culture attitudes, this one actually is one of my favorites. I think this is like the basis of everything that we want to do in the classroom with multilingual learners. So until teachers change their perception of the resources that the students bring with them in the classroom, and until teachers recognize themselves as teachers of multilingual learners, not to mention their own multilingual or bilingual identities, I don't think we can even talk about enacting the multilingual term. Some of the practices that teachers can foster are showing an interest in student linguistic resources. This model is based on a project that we did at a school in Norway. When we first started it, some of the teachers didn't even know what languages their students speak. And so as a result of our work with them, by the end of the project, they had these rich portfolios of, well, who are my students? What are their funds of knowledge? Which cultures do they come from? What languages do they know? What languages are they interested in? So that is something that is Metacognition, metalinguistic awareness refers to enhancing opportunities by helping students prepare and plan for their learning and creating links between past and new learning. So again, the importance, for instance, of funds of knowledge. And then metalinguistic awareness, which is naturally strengthened in multilinguals, but still it needs to be promoted through specific tasks and activities to help students build on the linguistic knowledge that they have and to be aware of language. I need to speed up a little bit. Multiliteracy. This indicator stresses the importance of developing literacy skills in all different languages, but also in different modalities. And also the importance of creating literacy-rich environments in the classroom to help students learn. And then finally, teacher and learner language use. Well, it draws on these very basic ideas that we all know from long, long ago. So simplified input, opportunities for production and engagement of full linguistic repertoires. But here we're also drawing in this idea that it should be in all different languages that students bring with them in the classroom. Giving learners opportunities, for instance, to clarify concepts in the languages that they bring with them from home. So to conclude, we envision the MAID model as a tool that can be employed for a range of purposes. It can be used for instructional design in K-12 contexts, but it can also be used as a curriculum design tool for teacher education and teacher professional development. And in fact, this is something we have been doing at my institution. We have a course that is based on this model. It can also be used for assessment of classroom practices. It can be used for teacher self-evaluation and reflection. It can be used for classroom observation and feedback, for instance, for peer feedback, or for administrators to see what is going on in their classrooms and then use that as a way to improve practices at the whole school. And finally, as a data collection tool, and this is something that we really want to work on. This is our research agenda, is to use MAID to actually conduct research. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Kristen Lindahl, who wrote along with her colleagues Chapter 10 of the book, Collaboration, Identity, and Internationalization, Professional Development for TWIL in Brazil.
Thank you and good morning, and thanks of course to TIRF and of the series and volume editors for your amazing work and support of emerging and ongoing scholarship. I'm also excited to present this chapter because I think it helps call attention to the work being done in the Global South, which has also been somewhat underrepresented, and so I'm happy to share a lot of the exciting work that's being done in Brazil, actually, as a country. So I composed this chapter with two of my colleagues, Chris Gibbick and Tatiana Avila de Campos Rocha, and Chris is a language specialist at Unicinos, and Tatiana is actually an engineering professor. So I learned a lot of engineering in the composition of this chapter and the project. So moving on, the context of the professional development is that PMG at Unicinos, PMG is their overall program that's, engineering program that's focusing on internationalizing their undergraduate education programs. So one goal of the program, one goal of the program is that they wanted to implement content and language integrated learning in their undergraduate STEM courses, which of course included engineering. So approximately 100 professors were involved in this online professional development, and their goal was internationalizing, innovating, and implementing CLIL. And so, as I mentioned, the authors were the three of us who did a self-study after the fact on how the PED program worked. Just for a little more context, there were 4 modules in our online course. So the first addressed the relationship between internationalization and integrating language in the content areas. The second looked at what is the role of language in the academic, quote-unquote, content areas. The third helped them then design student outcomes and activities related to the language demands of their engineering content area. And then in the fourth module, we discussed how to assess and provide feedback to students on what they were producing with regard to both content and language. So as you can imagine, being engineering professors, this was a bit different lens to implement on their content with regard to how they would work with their students, of whom they were very large groups and primarily native speakers of Portuguese, or Elwyn speakers of Portuguese. I keep getting that wrong. All right. So the first thing I did as the professional development consultant was conducted a needs analysis with stakeholders. So in this needs analysis, they articulated a few things. The first was they wanted an update on some research-supported practices with specific reference to additive approaches to multilingualism that Anna just talked about. Translanguaging was specifically mentioned as a frame from which to view the CLIL implementation. And this was an important shift, especially for them, from the policies of language separation that had traditionally or previously characterized some of the content-based settings. So in the program, integrating in the program, the content about CLIL was delivered in English, but discussion about the content and activities in the online breakout rooms could take place in any language. So we had like small groups, Jamboard, Padlet, Chat, Kahoot, Flipgrid. Many of the professors themselves were bilingual or multilingual with a varying range of languages studied. And we did a lot of conversation around the notion that George Bunch promotes around the language of ideas versus the language of display. So in the small groups, any language could be used relative to the group, but then when we came together in the whole group, then we all shared in English. But a lot of metalinguistic conversations occurred about the nature of multilingual practices relative to the engineering content. So those connections were really fascinating. And I'll share just a couple here with you. So in the self-study, they talked about how there seemed to be layers of knowledge required to the teaching of CLIL. Having good command of the language is often thought of as being the most important ones. However, the course brought to light a series of other layers, acknowledging language and academic genres as part of the teaching goals, defining goals and assessment as how to teach them, and then the need of technological skills. Another comment was that the academic language use, regardless of the language, is not in a menu of skills to be focused on in class and later on assessed. The language or learning of academic and professional reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and I love this part, as an engineer, right, happens incidentally as participants are exposed to some occurrences and genres along their academic lives. So there was a lot of focus on not compartmentalizing language instruction, but how to use it as a professional in their field. And then last but not least, I appreciated this one as well, because I think with the approach to multilingualism that we attempted to implement, there was a lot of deconstruction of native speaker ideologies in terms of how they were feeling about their own language proficiency and capacity to teach engineering in English to a group of students who may or may not be multilingual in many ways. So I really appreciated this quote, and they said, with time, they changed their minds because they, meaning the professors, actually came to this conclusion. The professors thought, okay, I can communicate, maybe not in the same way, kind of parenthetically as a native speaker, quote, but I'm not teaching for US students, I'm teaching for Brazilian students. So I think they were looking at sort of getting in the notion of world Englishes and how maybe the native speaker they had in their mind of who should teach engineering in English at the beginning of the project had deconstructed along the way into helping them feel increasing self-efficacy as teachers of CLIL themselves with regard to engineering and English. And so I really felt like that was an important outcome of the project around their own identity development as CLIL educators. So some discussion, as I mentioned, we arrived at the idea that recognition of CLIL as more than being able to speak and or deliver content in English, but it's also a focus on how language is embedded in your pedagogical practices. We explored the embedded flexible boundaries of language use or languaging, right, rather than the fixed boundaries of named languages. And so I really think this helps support their identity negotiation as professors of content and language. So one of my final conclusions in this chapter was that if CLIL can become a space for multiliteracies, where learners and professors can draw on their linguistic and semiotic repertoires to engage in critical meaning making, then professional development should reflect that as well. So we really want to, of course, continue to model what we encourage others to implement, which I think most of you in this room, if not all, would agree with. And I know we all really try to do that in our field. So just a note on project expansion since the chapter has been published. The engineering faculty, many of them enjoyed it so much they engaged in a follow-up project to get peer mentoring and structured feedback on their CLIL unit. Thank you, that they wanted to develop. Which they successfully implemented this academic year. And also 3 Unicinos engineering professors who were participants in the project were able to come to the United States in March of 2022, so just about a year ago, to see the facilities, educational spaces, and things that we had in the US. And our 2 institutions are now working to set up an exchange where their engineering students and some professors will come study at UTSA. So that bullet is actually, I have a meeting when I get back to Texas after the conferences to continue to set that up for the fall. And so here they are, the Brazilian faculty and I are on our UTSA campus in the photo on the left, and that's one of our engineering spaces from our undergraduate engineering lab on the right. And so, much like Beth, I also want to acknowledge that this project was funded by the U.S. Department of State English Language Programs and came out of the work that I did as a specialist there. So, thank you all so much. Sorry about the microphone. I appreciate your feedback.
Okay, now we will take a few minutes. If you have any questions for the speakers, Ryan is going to bring around the microphone if we need it. And we welcome questions. And Zach and Anna, I don't know if you want to come up front. Let's see if we have any questions. Comment? Richard?
Just a little curious for the first, the STEM speaker. Did those kids know the level that their class was listed at? Were they aware that there was a lot?
No, I don't think there was a goal that students would be able to just in the class that they were assigned.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, please.
I'm wondering if Anna speaks Portuguese from your time there? And is that like, yes.
Oh, yeah, I'm Kristen.
Oh, Kristen, I'm sorry. Anna was the one before you.
Yeah, no problem. I learned a little bit. It was really a fun experience. I'm English-Spanish bilingual, and so I was okay reading a lot of their submissions in Portuguese. But that was actually kind of part of the exchange.
Good, doing okay.
Sort of that, like Anna mentioned, was kind of that translanguaging awareness of different languages, and they were very patient and kind with me as I learned. And so we talked a lot about our positionality as kind of lifelong learners, and so I also positioned myself that way as I wanted to learn from their context. So I think that also came out of the needs analysis. I was like telling them what they needed. They told me what they wanted me to facilitate, which is a little different.
There you go, Wayne.
Thank you, those are all great presentations. So question for Kristen, were they aware, like, did they call it CLIL? Or were they doing it without realizing it was CLIL?
Oh, yeah, great question. So with regard to CLIL, we talked about it and defined it in that first session because they wanted to know what was the difference between CLIL and EMI.
Yeah.
And to me, that was a critical distinction in the two. And so I think once they appreciated the CLIL approach because it centered their expertise in the content, and they didn't feel like there was so much pressure on the English part that it had to be an all EMI class. And so, but they negotiated that a long time, even in the second modality still, of like, well, the CLIL isn't just changing your language, right? It's that all the framework of practice. Yeah, but I did that first off to be sure everyone knew what we were doing.
Hi, I have another question for Kristen. In your slides, you mentioned something about incidental learning, like the academic genres. And could you elaborate on that? Because I would actually see that. I would expect that to be where it was explicit and intentional rather than incidental.
Oh, yeah, I think where their reflection and with regard to that quote, if I'm remembering the one that you're referring to, I think that was my colleague Chris who mentioned that. She was referring to, I think, how much language learning and practice the professors did in the project, and then how they realized that as they were learning the CLIL content with regard to their content, they had done a lot of incidental learning themselves. So there was a lot of explicit attention to the language demands of STEM, and particularly engineering. I went through a lot of engineering and vocabulary and textbooks. But then I think the incidental learning that occurred was sort of what she was reflecting when the content was presented in that medium, how they picked it up as they engaged in context. Okay, that clarifies that a little bit.
But were you encouraging incidental learning, or were you saying that now they could make it intentional?
Oh yeah, I think what they were noting was they had previously thought that like English had to be sort of only explicitly taught. Sort of like separate from the content.
Right.
But then what they realized was that integrated, that a lot of incidental learning occurred.
Okay, thank you. Thank
But
you.
yeah, there was a lot of explicit attention to language, especially in the first two modules.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
My question is about the English language learners in fourth grade. How many of them were newcomers, and how many of them had already been through the U.S. school system, starting in pre-K maybe, or kindergarten? And what difference do you think that makes?
That's a great question,
I-
and to be honest, I have to go back.
I'm gonna get my steps in today.
Thank you for the question. I have to go back into my data to chart that, but most of the students have been identified in kindergarten. So, you know, by fourth grade, that would have been their 5th year of English learning. Possibly some of them had arrived, you know, in later grades, but most of them, you know, and we know that most English learners that are identified in elementary school are actually born here in the United States. So chances are they came in K.
Got time for one more? Okay. Okay. There you go.
I have a question. First of all, I'm interested in the MAID model and its components as a contribution. I couldn't help but think about SIOP as I was looking at it and wondering how different you think this is, what the similarities might be, what it might offer us now that we know more. We know it's about translating the gene and so forth.
There you go.
Well, SIOP is a wonderful tool and I've used it myself for many years. I think it continues to evolve, obviously, from edition to edition. Its original intention was for the development of English language, and so that was its primary focus. So I think there are elements of MAID that come from a very different perspective on language, but in terms of how it's used, I think it's intended to be used for teachers. There's so many overlaps, as in all educational contexts. Those of us who've been teacher educators for 1,000 years know about that we have to have indicators to help teachers organize their thinking, and we need features to operationalize those indicators. And although SIOP moves through that in a different way and for a different purpose, there are some similarities. But I think we never want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, ever, especially with that model, which is really wonderful. And research-based. And MAID is relatively new. We have 3 or 4 publications on the research that we've been doing, and we have 3 or 4 in progress. But as you know, SIOP's been around for a long time, so it has a stronger research base coming from a different perspective. Thank you.
It's on the topic. I was wondering if you said it could be used for like self-assessment and giving feedback to different schools or educators. Has there been any research on schools or districts doing that, or is that forthcoming? Just want to see that.
So we started using it in workshops with teachers a little bit. As I said, the model developed with the project, so it was in the later stages of the project that we started doing that. Our plan is now to do more thorough and planned research with the model and how it can be used. So as Max said, it's a new tool. We haven't had many opportunities. We just applied for another grant, and if we get that, we will be using it extensively.
Thanks, Anna. Anybody else? Sure. I'm sorry. She's here. She's in the back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
You want to use this?
Okay. Is it on?
Yep.
Okay, I think after hearing the first 3 presentations, and I'm sure it'll be confirmed with the others, that you can see what a rich set of contributions that we, the editors, had to work with, and we're very, very grateful for a wide range of topics, even within the general theme of integrating language and content, and a range of national and language contexts. So we're going to move on now to our next speaker, Tamrika Khvtisiashvili, who with MaryAnn Christison authored the chapter on using the design thinking approach for the delivery of EMI instruction for pre-engineering students in Palestine. And I didn't.
Oh, you did, good.
You're good.
Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning. I want to thank TIRF, of course, and co-author MaryAnn Christison. I'm delighted to work with her, continue to work with her, and I'm also delighted to present research from an area of the world that doesn't get a lot of research presented on or research being done. So I'll be talking about using design thinking approach for the delivery of EMI for pre-engineering students in Palestine. So the purpose of research, to explore the potential of design thinking as a tool for integrating language and content in EMI. I want to know how many of you have heard of design thinking as a tool, as a concept. Some people. I feel like it's semi-new. I actually don't know how new, but definitely new enough that I remember learning about it a few years ago. As a colleague now, a friend, was developing the program as part of architecture program initially at the University of Utah. So before I get more into talking about design thinking, let me talk about the motivation for the research. So as we know, English medium instruction has typically not been conceptualized to support the development of disciplinary content in English in general, but definitely not in Palestine. Many universities, higher education institutions in Palestine don't really have any kind of requirements for before students begin their studies. Studies are in English. There are pretty much no schools that teach in Arabic, even though, of course, everyday life is conducted in Arabic, and the jobs that the students get afterwards are in Arabic, mostly, although they use English a lot. But as students begin their studies, it's all done in English, and they're using English textbooks, and it's being instructed in English. There's no real requirements. Sometimes there's one class that's being offered before they begin their studies in English. So EMI teachers are typically experts, of course, in their disciplines, but they're definitely not experts in English, and I'm not talking about their proficiency, but they're not experts in teaching English or giving any kind of instruction and feedback. So there's often this big discontent. So what is design thinking? Design thinking is a methodological approach to creative problem solving with the goal of identifying and solving complex societally based problems. So basically what happens, a small group of individuals come together and consider a problem. And I'll talk about some of the problems that were considered in our project. But they consider a problem, they set goals, they research the problem, they talk about it, they involve the community, they discuss it with multiple stakeholders. It's really important part of design thinking that multiple perspectives are taken and given in trying to figure out how to solve a certain problem. So it usually comes from engineering perspective and from, let's say, philosophical perspective and societal, political, and so on. So it's really important that different perspectives are taken. So this design, the way it was conducted, was a collaboration between two universities. One of them was in Al-Khalil, or Hebron, in West Bank, Palestine, and one in the United States, University of Utah. And in the current study, all the students involved that I was working with were pre-engineering students, and they proposed problems that they deal with literally every day. The list was something they came up with themselves and put themselves into groups of interest. Some of the problems were things like bad roads, water collection loss, unreliable electricity, urban congestion, recycling, farming rights. There were about a dozen groups, I believe. And again, the problems were self-identified. And we spent a little bit of time on that, which in itself was a really interesting process. The design thinking project required for students to work in teams. So they had to research the problem, they had to interview people connected to those areas. So sometimes it was literally their families. Sometimes there were different community businesses, let's say. Sometimes there was municipalities, like government officials, for instance, it was about the roads or transportation. They had to interview people, they had to read many articles, they had to discuss, and they had to actually visit the places themselves and kind of create and collect all the information. The U.S. side was designed to work with them directly. So on the U.S. side, also students were put in a group that worked individual groups worked with individual groups in Palestine, so American team worked with Palestinian team, and they had to discuss and understand what those problems were. The American students were design thinking majors. So this is kind of what the process looked like. We started with framing, with each section, they met once a week. This was all during COVID, I believe, yes, and so it was online. Well, it would have been online anyway because there were Americans and they were in the US, but so they would meet online and discuss. We started with framing, so they met up and they just started to talk about what the problem was and kind of frame the whole situation. As you can imagine, because the problems are quite complex in Palestine, a lot of time was spent on trying to identify and understand and explain what the issue was to the American students. Then there was a meeting which was more of an kind of an interview session, and that was the preparing and conducting interviews to understand the issues deeper. So students came with questions and answers on both sides. So at this point, the Palestinian students had already done some research, so they were able to answer some of the questions on the deeper level. The analysis was making sense of what has been learned, right? So kind of synthesizing the needs and insights between, again, the questions from the Americans and also for Palestinian students, even though they, of course, knew the problem they were talking about because they've had to deal with it every day, they gained a lot of knowledge what those problems actually were and where exactly they stemmed from. So for them, it was an amazing learning process, even though it dealt with their own daily life. And then it was followed with ideation. So this is where different solutions were presented. So deciding how something could be solved. When we're talking about design thinking, it's not usually like, obviously some of these issues cannot be solved in one course. People have spent a lot of energy and time to solve those issues, but small ideas that could maybe make it possible. So this was the refinement, and then implementation. It had to be visually presented. It had to be either a video or a presentation on both sides that they, in collaboration, created to implement that design thinking. So theoretical foundations, of course, according to sociocultural theory, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, there was so much help and so much involvement and learning in between the Palestinian students because of their own exchanges, but also with the Americans, and through interviews and better understanding and having to explain the problems to somebody on the outside. So a lot of learning opportunities, communities of practice, so students had amazing opportunities to interact with each other, to create teams, to build relationships, to deal with a lot of misunderstandings also because of the situation, and maybe most importantly, have multi-dimensional perspectives on the issue and on the solutions. And then pedagogical translanguaging, really important, I believe, in general, but this idea that it's okay to kind of speak, to discuss some of those issues in Arabic, as I couldn't control, obviously, all the times that we're speaking to each other and working together. But then when they had to present and when they had to talk about it more, it was in English, right? So it was a lot of back and forth, both languages were used. This is what their life actually looks like once they get the jobs, the Arabic and English. So the questions, learners' perceptions of the challenges they faced, learners' perceptions of working in teams, and teachers' perceptions of the benefits of using design thinking. We collected it through questionnaires, through assignments, and the journaling. So students perceived, as you would imagine, that productive skills were more difficult than receptive skills. They had much harder time summarizing, paraphrasing, and especially linking the ideas, and also speaking accurately and confidently with their American counterparts was harder than they imagined it would be, especially about engineering. Implications, they're using English to communicate about real-world problems and issues in small groups is so important, so it's so valuable. To use the language outside of academic setting. Having, as they worked with US-based counterparts, using spoken and written English in situations that would be typically outside of what they would be using in their everyday engineering world afterwards. And many problems presented by Palestinian students were sensitive ones, so this was a really interesting thing to consider for both sides. And of course, created a lot of language learning opportunities and real-world opportunities. Summary in this short presentation, this is just the introduction to some of the important sides of the research. We plan to do more. I do want to acknowledge, I think I'm out of time, I want to acknowledge that this was done as part of English language programs when I was a specialist in Palestine. Thank you very much. Happy to answer your questions.
Take care.
Okay, our final speaker for the session. We're thrilled that she was able to fit us into this schedule. Joyce Kling, president of TESOL, who co-authored with the chapter on EMI teacher cognition, exploring lectures, experiences across Europe. Welcome, Joyce. Thank you for being here.
I do two computers here at the same time. Can you hear me okay? All right. Thank you to TIRF. Thank you for having such a focus in this area. I was a recipient in 2012, and the discussions about EMI were just beginning. In fact, the term hadn't really been coined. We were still talking about English taught programs, and there were questions about, well, what do we mean by this context? Who's controlling the slides? Okay, because I didn't want to before we get. This is fun. I want to talk about a program, a project that I was involved in Europe, where we were finally looking mostly at in the synergy between here in Brazil and Palestine, these issues of EMI in English, non-English dominant contexts where university instruction goes on and not in English typically. So non-English dominant. And I want to make that distinction because we're not talking about English dominant institutions, and we're also not talking about university campuses that are established from English dominant. So for example, in Education City in Qatar, where we have institutions like Carnegie Mellon and such that are American institutions in a non-English dominant setting. So the focus is to tell you about TAKE, the Transnational Alignment of English Competences for University Lectures. And this was a project that took place in 5 European countries, including both north, south, east, west, countries that had a great deal of experience and less experience. And we were building on essentially research that had gone on in Western Europe. over since the turn of the century in the decade, and we could see that the research is focused, I don't need to repeat it because we just heard a lot of what you see on the left, based on also what's going on in Brazil and what's going on in Palestine. But our focus was really this aspect on the right, and when I say this is a teacher cognition study, my work with TIRF that I had gotten my DGU funding for was also a teacher cognition study about identity. I was meeting professors and they were literally being told from May, oh, by the way, in September, you're teaching your course in English. Or it might be in December, from February 1st, you're teaching your course in English. That'll be okay, right? No problem. And we were also mandated, when I was at the University of Copenhagen, to assess lecturers English. So full professors are being told after a long career, we need to go to the center across campus, and these applied linguists are going to assess your language. We've had a long, successful career. What does this do to one's identity in terms of their experience? So we were looking at the pedagogical considerations of what goes on for teacher training. And these aspects, they are exacerbated in these non-English dominant settings. When the requirements are a little bit foggy, and very often they are considered from English dominant norms. The expectation, both for the professors, and we heard this from Brazil, and we heard this from Palestine, people are saying, am I supposed to sound like an American professor or like a British professor? Not a lot of time here. So let me tell you about the context. As I mentioned, 5 countries, and I said north, south, east, west because I was affiliated at the University of Copenhagen. It was also with Spain and Lleida, which is just west of Barcelona in the north. The Netherlands, Italy, and Croatia. Now, Croatia had only had EMI for about 4 or 5 years at this point when we started the project, compared to the Netherlands, where the publications go back to the 1990s and their research. So we were really trying to look both culturally, pedagogically, and just the different academic cultures of very different institutions, some that are hundreds of years old, some that are 20 years old. What was going on? Participants ranged, the project participants came from these universities. The participants were talking about our lecturers across 3 disciplinary fields. They were social scientists and humanities, life and medical sciences, physical sciences. We had 30 volunteers, 6 lecturers from 5 institutions, and they were both observed in their general teaching schedules. We did not observe them in the first few weeks. We wanted their classes to fall in place. We did not observe them as they were getting towards exam, but mid-semester they were observed, and then we had semi-structured interviews with them to find out their perceptions. Our research questions you can see on the screen. What are the levels of the EMI lecturers' oral English skills for the purpose of teaching university content courses? And this, of course, drew from the fact that we have been testing teachers in Copenhagen, assessing teachers in Copenhagen since 2009. And we were looking to see about how could this test be used across these different contexts and align it with the common European framework of reference so that we could get a standard. What teacher training or English language training experience do EMI teachers have then in relation to teaching in higher education? And then linking these 2 questions, what do they think about this? I'm going back to them. And I'm linking back to my own original research. So what the findings then told us here, that we were talking to individuals who had been teaching for at least 7 years, but this was an average between 70 and 30 years. These have been university instructors. Their EMI teaching experience was between 1 and 30 years with a mode of 7, and 2/3 of them were teaching in both languages. So they were very aware of the differences between teaching in English and teaching in, usually their L1 for some of them, it might have been their L2 even. We found in the Netherlands we had very multilingual instructors who often were using their 2nd or 3rd language, where if Dutch wasn't their first. And the distinction really had to do with whether it was graduate or undergraduate and the program of instruction, but otherwise it was quite similar. When we began looking at their proficiency, we first, the people who went into observe had been normed about rating. Let me go back. They were observed, they were digitally recorded. We then had a full 3-day alignment of it's called the Test of Oral English Proficiency for Academic Staff, which I was a part of developing at the University of Copenhagen with the CEFR. And in this 3-day alignment, we then created links to the Common European Framework based on these 30 digital recordings. After having been normed, the raters then assessed a holistic score, because see, we have a very normal distribution. It's essentially a perfect bell, where we have at the C1 level, which is what we are. We could also see that our test aligned where we had a certification level was really at the B2 plus level, but we still had some of the professors fall in at the B2 level, general. No one was really at the B2 minus, but we had an 8-point scale. And what you're seeing on the left side here was we also asked the raters to look not just at a holistic score, but to break it down, particularly with the new CEFR, companion volume, that's identifying beyond pronunciation. We're always hearing about these EMI lectures being concerned about very language-specific elements. And yes, the professors who were rated at the B2 level were falling in at lower levels with aspects of phonology, tends to be the lowest, accuracy. But what we're finding with audience awareness, interaction, and mediation, they were all falling in the C1 plus range. So, well, what are our concerns? Are our concerns accuracy in terms of L1 production norms, or are they able to reach their students because they actually have these skills in terms of audience awareness, interaction, mediation? And beyond that, when trainers are coming in, what are they focusing on when they're training? And the low-hanging fruit is pronunciation. We can't get very far with that, and the teachers are frustrated then because what they're needing are quill training and other things. And again, we're not talking about having done an intervention. We're asking the teachers, the lecturers, full professors, tenured individuals who've been working for 30 years in the classroom. So what we saw is that 50%, we asked these people, I'll put my notes down, 50% say they had no training, 11 out of 30 had taken a university course, and this is because in the north and in Croatia, it's mandatory to get tenure. You have to have a pedagogy course. You can't just teach because you have a PhD. But in the south, this isn't the case. Pedagogy is not focused on in Southern Europe. And so while they worked with international students, they had this, they had classroom reflections, but there had been no real specific focus on methodology. Just want to show you a couple of quotes because I only have 2 minutes here. You can see on the left some of our findings, but the teachers in terms of their practices said the complex backgrounds of the students, their varied scientific background, and you suddenly also have in-between students who have English that's not so strong. So they're struggling both between people coming in with different disciplinary background and then the linguistic background. I'm going to go to the next. In terms of culture and language proficiency, the teachers here really took a pragmatic approach. If students didn't have to be tested to get into the program, like we hear in Palestine, like we hear in Italy, they're just merged in. The teachers are saying there are going to be times where I'm going to be more lenient in the exam as long as I can see that their content understanding is here. Also because I'm not trained myself to help with the language. So the vocabulary and visual support are very much present with the bilingual groups, much more present than when I'm teaching in my L1, when I'm teaching in Krulatz, and you've had a chance to read it. One more slide with some quotes. The lectures did not demand linguistic accuracy or fluency from their students. They're more concerned with content. And what we hear in this salmon color is, no, I'd say the aspect I pay most attention to is when speaking English is to speak in such a way as to be understood. And the message I try to give them is that English is the instrument, the importance is the content, not the form. So I have implications for the future. Can we make sure that we're treating professionals as professionals? That these are experienced lecturers and they're saying, do the needs assessment, and make sure that we know how content teachers across the disciplines are prepared to teach, both in terms of pedagogy and language. These people have set teacher identities. These are their words, not ours. They have set teacher identities, and that we need to be considering the goals for training. These need to be supplemental and localized. Again, the point of this transnational alignment really was to say, you're doing this in Palestine, and you're doing this in Brazil, and we're doing this in Denmark, or in Sweden, or in Italy. But what happens when we compare this across? And can we be learning from each other that we can tweak? So we need to be thinking about the lecturer's experience, their practice, their previous training, and then their discipline, which is what we heard earlier. Thank you to TIRF. Thank you to the House Leader.
Thank you, Joyce. Now we've got some time for discussion. If you have any comments or questions for the last two speakers, and then we'll open it up for all speakers. If there are further thoughts.
But the synergy was very nice. Thank you for putting this together.
Questions,
Anything for
comments?
any of the speakers? We don't have to, or any general thoughts about the integrating levels of content that should be considering for the future?
Thanks, June.
Thank you. Thank you. In one of the universities in China, Southern, called SUSTEC, Southern Institute of Technology, TIRF was commissioned to do a review about their EMI classes. So as one of the 3 reviewers, I went to observe several classes. And I noticed the differences between 2 EMI classes, mostly in biology. One teacher speaks fluent English, but students did not seem to catch, and they kept reading Chinese in comparison with speaking. And the other teacher also speaks English, but has a way to engage students, not in their proficiency level, but in more of the way of thinking and the delivery. So I'm thinking in EML classes, when we assess teachers' competence, the fluency being important, what is something else that can really set it apart from what they learn in their native language? Yeah, I mean, we assess teachers' English, if you speak good English, but the reality is that speaking good English is one thing. How to deliver in a way that students will be engaged is different. And that is related to these 2 teachers' background. One teacher who studied in the United States, and he delivered with great confidence and humor. And the other teacher who did not study in the United States, but he focused on proficiency, accuracy, and fluency, but he delivered English in Chinese way. And students would rather focus on Chinese textbook. So I found that's very intriguing. Any comments?
I could add a little bit about that if you want to. I think that's an interesting question and an interesting observation as well. I think the professors in Brazil had a similar kind of conception around, like, my proficiency isn't good enough, so maybe I won't be good enough at it. But when they realized that the focus of a lot of what we were talking about is actually on the integration with the pedagogical abilities, that strengthening their pedagogical base increased their self-efficacy with both. And I think that was an important distinction that, like you said, focusing only on the mode of delivery. But it was also what was going on in the classroom and how they were creating opportunities to engage with the content and the language, not just delivering in the language. Did you want to say
June, this is exactly what we were finding, because there was a lecture that when I assessed his video from Italy, He was an older professor, and his English fell on the farthest end at the B2 level. But he was so engaging, and he would use the compensatory strategies and say things like, "Someone give me the word," right? So he was asking students to say, fill in the blanks, because I'm here as an expert in the content. It was in medicine. He said, I'm the expert. You need this information from me, and I'm dying. I'm a passionate teacher. And he said to us in the interview, when they said I would teach in English, I was afraid I was going to have to change who I was. Right? And this comes because at the same time in Italy, they had purchased training from a program, to remain nameless, that was very English dominant, normed. And it didn't fit, the soup didn't fit him. But when he could teach in the way that he taught, in his level, with a language center supporting him, he was never saying that they shouldn't have support in English. What he was saying is, I know what my boundaries are, and then I'll try to help with that.
Thanks, Joyce. Time for one more question.
One more question?
Yeah.
I've never said
Yeah.
Hi, I'm just about going way back to the STEM students. You were talking about STEM students, right? Yeah. I was just thinking, you're going to continue to work with those schools, right?
Not those exact same schools.
Oh, because it's such a complex and difficult issue. And you can see that in all the quotes from the teachers. So I was thinking it would be so helpful if their work on this, those who are working to not lower the students who don't speak English as a native language, to document their stories. You know, what did we do and what difference did it make? Because that's what schools really need, is to hear what, not be told this is bad, but hear, okay, what did you do? What was your process, and then what happened? Anyway, I was just thinking about that, but I'm trying to give you more to do.
Thanks, David. You want to wrap it up?
Sure.
Don't read the books.
Thanks to all of us, and thanks to all of you for hanging in with us and listening to all the wonderful synopses of very interesting chapters. I would like to encourage you to take copies of the TIRF Insights reports that are on your table. They're there for you to take. And we also have several copies of books in the series that will be available to the first. We don't have any way of allocating them, so the first person who comes up and asks for it. We have 3 copies of this book and a couple of copies of some of the earlier volumes of the series. So if you're interested in a free book that has great content based on research that was supported by TIRF mostly, I encourage you to come on up and see us. And we've got a few, well, no, we don't, it's 10:30. But anyway, if you want to hang around and chat for a minute, please do so as well. Thank you very much.